I have a countdown. Mine is.
Oh, and we're live. Hello and welcome to this student step-by-step guide to getting started with Katana. I'm Arielle. I'm a creative specialist here at Foundry, and I'll be holding this session today alongside my colleague, Brian, who is also a creative specialist for Katana. So he's based in Toronto and I'm in London, and I'm aware we have people calling in from all around the world. So hello to you all. It's great to have you all here. I'm aware this is exam period, so thanks for taking the time to be here. So I'm going to do my best to speak slowly. If at any point I do speed up, let me know and I'll slow down. This session is for you, so I want to make sure that you can all understand me well. Feel free to ask questions along the way. There's a questions section on this page on the right. So just write it down, and we have Brian on the call who's going to answer those as we go along. So don't keep all those questions bottled up. Ask them as they come. There's also a polls section where you can let us know if you have been able to download the webinar material from the link. So this is a step-by-step guide. So I highly encourage you to follow along if you do have that. So the aim for this session is to help you get to grips with some of the basic functionalities in Katana. So if you're thinking of using it for one of your projects, but you're not entirely sure how to use it, this is the session. This is the session for that. So we will be focusing on getting that initial learning process going. And so it will be for beginners. So it's aimed for people who haven't used Katana before or who are just starting to learn it. A lot of the time when you're learning a new software, it's not always obvious where to look. So that's what this session is really all about. Again, I'll repeat this as we're going along. Feel free to ask questions at any time. No matter how basic it is, we're happy to stop and answer them. I'm now going to go ahead and open up the Katana project we sent to you in advance. You should have gotten a link to a zipped file to download. So there's a test Katana file, and when you open that, you should get this. So let me just open that. Great. So you have instructions here. So we sent this over to make sure that you got a render working as long as you have this. So if you follow the instructions, right-click on the button, render test nodes, that's this button over here. So if I right-click it and select preview render, you should see these two spheres in this monitor tab. So I'll kick things off by explaining the interface. So this is the default interface. You should all have this if you're opening Katana for the first time. So these 5 tabs is really the only tabs we're going to use in this session. So there are many other tabs, as you can see, but we have what we need for today. It's worth mentioning that we are going to be using 3D Light as a renderer during this session. Katana is render agnostic, but 3D Light is the renderer that it ships with. So if you have Katana, you should have 3D Lights and should be able to follow along. So I'm going to go ahead and explain what each of those tabs do. So the monitor is where you can preview your rendered images. You can navigate this tab by middle mouse button drag and around, and so that's how you can transform around. You can zoom in and out by scrolling. And there are similar manipulations for the node graph as well. So this is the heart of Katana, is where you have your entire node network. So if I middle mouse button drag, you can see it can move around. And if I zoom in and out by scrolling, then this is how you move around basically in the 2D spaces within Katana. So the 3D viewer is where you have all of your 3D assets. So all your 3D geometry will appear over here. Right now it's empty, but we'll get back to that in a second. So if you hold Alt, left button drag, then you can rotate around. You can select Alt, right right button drag, and that will zoom in and out. You can also zoom in and out using the middle mouse button and scroll, so it's going to be less smooth, but that's another way you can do that. So the parameters tab will show you the parameters of the node that you are currently setting the edit flag to. So what this is if you hover over a node and hit E, that's going to show you the parameters for that node. This is a group node, so it doesn't have any parameters. And if you hover over this node and hit V, then this links back to the scene graph tab as well as the viewer tab. So basically, when you open up a Katana scene file, your 3D viewer will be empty. That's because your scene graph, the contents of your scene is collapsed. So when you start expanding things at the mesh level, that's when you can start previewing it in the 3D viewer. So I'm just going to go ahead and start building the scene. I'm going to start by creating a simple primitive, so a sphere. So to bring in a node, I can hit Tab. And the node that I'm looking for is a primitive create node. So I'm just going to start typing in primitive, PRI, and then that's the only node that matches that naming. So I'm just going to select this. You can select it by clicking on it, or you can hit enter and place it in your node graph. So right now the viewer and edit flag are set to this node over here. We want to set it to this one. So you can either double click on it or hover over the node and hit V or E. So in the parameters, you'll see that it has a name parameter. This is going to drive its hierarchy in the scene graph as well as its name. So if I start expanding my scene graph, if I go down to the mesh level, then you can see that my geometry is now, you can now see it in the 3D viewer. You can select it and select F to focus to that point. And I'm just going to change its name. I'm going to call it core. And you'll see that that updates its name directly in the scene graph. You can also drive its hierarchy. So if I want to add another level and call that assets or maybe primitive, then it's going to add another level to that hierarchy. So now I've created my sphere. I'm going to bring in the ABC file that exists within this folder directory that you would have downloaded. So in the zip file, there's a ABC folder where there is an asset. So I'm going to hit Tab again to bring in a node. So the node that I'm looking for is the Alembic in node. So if I type in Alembic in and select that, and if I view its parameters, so hover over this node and hit E, and select the view flag by hitting V, you'll see that right now there's no file specified. This is something that I'll need to do within this parameter. So my ABC asset parameter, if I click on this little arrow over here and select Browse, I have a folder called ABC within this folder, and I want to select this file over here, so Foundry Sphere 01. So now that I've done that, I can view this asset by expanding it. So you can either keep expanding elements in the scene selectively, or you can double click on a part of the scene graph, and it's going to expand everything. And as I can see, my asset is a lot larger than my sphere. So what I'm going to do is scale up my sphere. And actually, before I do that, you'll see that if I jump between these two nodes, they kind of exist, the sphere and my ABC assets exist within two different environments almost. So what I want to do is bring them together. So you can do that by creating a merge node. So if I hit Tab and type in merge, So that's one way of creating, of merging two assets together. You can select this little arrow over here, link it up to this input port for the merge, and do the same thing for the Alembic in. What you can also do, if I disconnect this for a second, is hit backtick over a node. So this is, a backtick is the keyboard above, the key above tab. I think it's different across different countries. So it basically means that if you're having trouble getting this little arrow over here, it just makes it easier to grab the output and input ports. And a shortcut for creating the merge node, if I select this and delete it, is to just select both nodes and hit M. And that's going to create a merge node. Now, if I view my scene from this point, if I hover over this node and hit V, then you'll see that both the core and the assets exist within the same environment. So that's what this flag is really all about, is if you start moving around your node graph, you can see what is actually happening at any given point. And that is really, really powerful. If let's say something goes wrong and you're not entirely sure where that is, then you can quickly trace back your steps and see exactly where there's an issue. So I'm going to scale up my sphere. So if I hover over this node and hit E, and you'll see that's already set to yes for the make interactive. So if I select my core within the scene graph, if I select that level, and if I toggle on one of the manipulators within the 3D viewer, then you'll see that I can start editing its position, its transformation. So you can hit W to enable and disable the transform manipulators, E for the rotation, and R for scale. So I'm just going to scale it all the way back up to around this value, 42 and a bit. And so now we have our sphere, our core, let's say, and our Alembic asset. So now what we're going to do is bring in a camera. So I'm going to hit Tab, select Camera Create, and you'll see that that's going to bring up this node. So if I select this and merge that with the rest of my scene, so I'll bring it to the same merge. Again, you can hit backtick to grab this output and the different ports. So now that I have a camera in the scene, if I hover over this node and hit E, I can see its parameters. It's put my camera within this place in the hierarchy. So this is where my camera is. And as soon as you have a camera in your scene, you can start viewing it in viewing from that angle within the viewer. So if I select on this little aperture symbol, right now I'm at the perspective view, and select my camera, then I'm now viewing the scene from that camera that I've just created. So I'm just going to zoom out, scroll out to a position where I can see my assets entirely. And we now have our camera. I'm going to set the parameter, the make interactive, to no, mainly because I don't necessarily want to change this value. If I'm moving around in the 3D viewer and I accidentally forget to revert back to the perspective view, then you might lose your transformation. So it's always nice to freeze that whenever you're happy with a positioning. So now that we've got our geometry in the scene and our camera, what we can do is create a material. So I'm going to hit Tab and select Material. And if I hover over this, hit E, then in its parameters, you can select the name of the material. So I'm going to call this matte white. So I'm just going to create a very temporary material for now. We just want to get something in the rendered, in the monitor for now. And so I'm going to select Add Shader, and I'll select a surface shader, and I'm going to create a DL principled. And I'm just going to leave the parameters as default. So I'm going to select this node and the merge, hit M to merge them together. So now I have a material, I have my geometry and my camera. So right now this material is not set to anything. So if I view my scene from this node, then you can see that I've got my materials over here. So we're going to assign this material to all the geometry in the scene. So I'm going to hit Tab and type in material and link those two together. And now if I view the, oh, sorry, I meant to create a material sign. You can also hit R over a node if you want to replace it with something else. And I am just clicking on the wrong shortcuts. So I can select backtick to connect this merge to the material sign. And so now I can, if I view my scene from this node, I can middle mouse drag this part of the scene graph over to this parameter. So that's a middle mouse button drag. And I'll do the same for the geometry. So you can select, I can actually assign it to this geo level, and it's going to apply this material to all the geometry that exists within that hierarchy. So I'm going to middle mouse button drag that over to this box over here, add statements. Oops. Basically, this is a cell statement. I'll get back to that. I probably won't cover this over this session, but you can basically select elements in the scene graph based off of path, collections, or a custom statement. So right now we've just set it to a path. You can add as many as you want. You can have it assign the difference between two paths. So it's quite powerful in what you can do with that. So now that we've got our material assigned, I'm just going to create a render settings node. Before I go, and I'll take a little break and make sure that everything's okay. Brian, on your side, are you getting any questions?
We had one about setting up the 3D render engine, but it looks like it's just an environment variables one.
Okay.
So to answer your question, Edgar, I hope that the response in chat helped. But if not, please feel free to submit another question, as I did run into a character limit in responding, so I wasn't able to send you the documentation.
Okay. Yeah, 3D Light should be set up by default. If you have previously set up other renderers, then it's possible that it's an issue with the environment that you set. Okay, are we happy to move on?
Yep, I think we're good to move on.
Great. So I can hit Tab and create a render settings node. So I'm going to link this back to the rest of my scene. If I hover over this and hit E, then you can specify which camera you want to render from, the renderer that you're using, and the resolution. I set my font to be quite large for this session. So if you can set this to, I'm just going to set this to HD for now. And you can set adjust screen window to adjust height to match resolution. It's just going to, if I hover this and hit V, this is going to change the kind of aspect ratio of my camera. So if I'm actually going to go back and increase this value over here to make it, there we go. So now we can see it from a higher distance. So you should have everything you need now to launch a render. So if I right click and select preview render, it's going to send off a render, and it's not doing anything because I have no lights in my scene. So I'm going to hit Tab and create a Gaffer3 node. So I'm going to put this underneath the material sign and hover over it and hit E to see its parameters. And so this is a super tool where you can create your lights. So I'm going to right click over here within this box and select Add 3D Light. And we're going to create an environment light. So in Katana, lights will have object, material, and linking parameters. The object parameters will control its positioning. So this is an environment light, so it won't need much positioning apart from perhaps some rotation. You have the material parameters where you have the shader attached to the lights, and you can tweak these parameters. And then you also have a linking tab. So I'm going to go back to the materials tab, and I'm going to bring in an image to assign to this light. So if I select browse, and if I go back up a level and go into the text folder within this group, then you can find the universe HDRI and select that. So now if I send a preview render again, then you can see the elements in my scene. The light is a bit dark, so I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit, bring it all the way up to 5, and preview render. So now we can see the elements in our scene. And if I zoom in, then I can see that I've got my core and I've got my geometry. Right, so now I feel like we are set to kind of create a network material. So we have a new node as of Katana version 3.2, which is the network material create node. So if I hit Tab and select network material create, then I can select this node. And what this is if I hit on this little, if I zoom in, if I hit this over here, you're going to enter a new kind of UI space where you can bring in all of your shaders. So if I hit Tab and type in DL principled, then that's going to create my shading node and attach it to the surface output port of this network material. So I want to bring in a texture to assign to this material. So if I hit Tab and File, so these are 3 light specific nodes, it's worth mentioning. And I place this in the scene. I'm going to plug the output color. So you can select on this, and it's going to select this port over here. And you can also expand parts of your shader by selecting this little arrow over here. And I'll plug it to my base color. And then I'm going to view its parameters by selecting this box or hovering over the node and hitting E. And you can select the image that you want to bring in. So we're going to bring in the earth underscore diff. So the diffuse image. And so now we should have everything set up for this material. So I'm just going to merge both materials together and then link up this output of this merge over to replace this one. So that's the benefit of having a node-based tool, is that you can unplug and rewire as you choose. So I'm going to select these nodes and drag them down, and I'm going to create another material assign. And you can actually select MA. It's going to pick out the capital letters if you want an easy way to search for nodes. Or what you can also do, if I remove this, is use the star symbol and I'll call in an assign, and it's going to pick out any node that matches that name. So I'm going to select on this material sign, add it to a scene, hover this and hit E to see its parameters. And I'm going to drag in, this time, my network material, but I just realized I haven't set a name to it. So I'm going to hover over this, hit E, and you can choose its material name over here. So I'm going to call this NMC for Network Material Create and Earth. So now if I go back to this material signs parameter, and if I middle mouse button drag this part of the scene graph over to the material sign parameter, and I can add statements and paths, and I'm going to bring in my call over here. So if I right click and select preview render as well, we should have a texture assigned to this material, but you can't really see it because it's kind of hidden by the other geometry. So what you can do to selectively render only specific parts of your scene is to select this over here. And you can then specify what parts of the scene you want to see. So I'm going to select this one, or what you can do if I untick it is shift select the level above it. It's going to select anything that's below that level. And I'm also going to select my lights and materials. So if I right click and select preview render, that should only render that sphere. But right now, I'm just going to rotate my light so that it's shining the front of it rather than the back. So I'm looking into the parameters of the Gaffer3 node, and within the object settings, I'm going to rotate it, I think, about 60 degrees. And also, you can also set up a live render. So that's quite a nice feature. If I select live render, it's only going to render the nodes that the parts of the scene that you specify on this column. So if I shift select my root level, it's going to put up everything for live rendering. So everything's going to update if there's any change at any point. So now you can see the Earth texture assigned to the sphere. So I'm going to unselect this, and the rest of my geometry is now appearing. And so I'm going to create a material for each of these different elements. So I'm going to create a new network material create. So again, you can hit tab, type in NMC. And I will bring this into this merge. And I'm going to hover over this and hit E. And I'm going to call this NMC underscore glass. So I'm going to create glass material. What you can also do is rename the nodes. So I'm going to call this glass material. And actually, it's probably more appropriate if I call this glass network. And then I'll call this network. So if I dive into here, then I can hit tab and create a DL glass. So I just typed in glass over here, and I've just now created a glass shader. So if I hover over this and hit E, then you can see its parameters. I'll set its reflection to a slight purple color. It's a little bit too purple. I'll just bring this up a little bit. And actually, I'll assign it before I start modifying anything. So I'm going to hit tab and MA for material sign. and put this in my node graph. And I'm going to middle mouse button drag this glass material over here. And then I'm going to select this geometry. So that's this outer core. So it's quite nice that when you select the geometry in the 3D viewer, it'll select it in the scene graph as well. So if I add this, then we now have our glass material assigned to this geometry. So if I'm just going to dive back in here to tweak it a little bit. I will set this to a slight, actually, I keep it to a white color. And we'll now create a metal material. If I hit tab and select a network material create node and call this NMC metal, and I select this node, hit enter to rename it, and I can say metal underscore network. I'm just going to plug this into this merge. And here I can hit tab and create a metal material. So all of these shaders are also documented within the 3D Lights documentation for Katana. So you can look back at that if you want to see what each of the parameters do. So I'm just going to create a metal layer and reduce down the roughness a little bit, bring this all the way up, and I'll just leave everything as is for now. And actually, when you start noticing that you have many nodes of the same type following each other, you can actually use a group stack. So it's going to stack all of them. So if I hit tab and type in group stack and select this, place this in my node graph, select E to see its parameters. And what you can do is control shift middle mouse button drag this material over here. That's just disconnected my scene, so it's not very happy. So I'm just going to do the rest for these two materials. And I'm going to rename them. I'm going to rename them MA white and MA underscore earth. This is just to keep everything organized. MA glass. And I'm going to create a new one. So when you stack nodes of the same type together, just plugging it into the scene now. When you hit this plus icon over here, it's going to create a new material of that same type. So I'm going to call this MA metal. And I'm going to middle mouse button drag this scene graph element, the metal material, over to this parameter. And I am going to select. So when there's a piece of geometry that you want to select, you're not entirely sure where it is in the scene graph, or you just don't want to expand the entire thing or pick it out in the viewer, what you can do is use this little picker icon, and you can control single left button click drag it across an element, and it's going to give you this little scene graph selection over here. If I select on this little arrow and select in scene graph, it's going to select the geometry this is assigned to. So if I just click away over here and I select this and select in scene graph, then you'll see that that has selected that that part of the geometry. So if I middle mouse button drag this over here, my live render broke, I think, when my node graph was disconnected. So if I'm going to send off another live render, or what you can do to repeat a preview render or a live render from the previous node that you had rendered from is to select Control backslash, excuse me. And that will repeat a render from that part of the scene. So now I've assigned my metal material. I'm actually also going to assign it to this little rope around here to speed things up a little bit. And I'm going to assign a basic material to this inner element. So I'm going to hit Tab and select a network material, create, and call this NMC. I'm going to call it concrete. And I'm going to link this into this merge. And I'm going to call this concrete network. And if I enter that network material and hit Tab, I'm going to create a DR principled. And I'm just quickly going to, I will set the specular level to 0, and I'll set it to a dark gray material like this. So now I'm going to assign this. I'll get back to my group stack. I'm actually going to rename this group stack material assign, so I know what's actually happening within this group stack. So if I select on this plus icon over here, and I'm going to middle mouse button drag the concrete material I've just created over to this parameter, and I'm also going to middle mouse button drag this inner core element. And I'm just going to increase the intensity of my lights here since it's a little bit dark all of a sudden. And I'm also going to create a new light, which is I'll select an add 3 light, area light. So that's going to create a new light. And if I go down to where these lights are being created in the scene graph, so it's over here, I've got my environment light, my area light. So what you can change in the sync selection is toggle it from off to in and out, and which means that when you select a light within the Gaffer 3 node, it's also going to select it within the scene graph. So you can enable it or disable it, it's entirely up to you. And I'm going to move this light across slightly. I'll scale it up quite a bit and rotate it around so it's pointing towards my sphere. There we go. And if you want to, what you can do within the object parameters is select enable aim constraint if you want it to be constrained to an object. And I'm going to put in my core geometry in here. So you can middle mouse button drag this scene graph element into this parameter, and you'll see that my light is now rotated towards that. And if I view from my camera, then you can see that I have my lights over here. I'm actually going to bring it back around here a little bit, lighting my scene. So is everything good on your side, Brian? Do you think we need to take a break answering questions, or are we okay?
I don't have any questions on my side right now. I think we're probably good to just keep going, hopefully.
Great. In that case, what I'm going to move on to is the group node. So you can select a group of nodes over and hit G. And this is going to group all of those elements together. So if you hit this plus symbol over here, it'll expand the elements of the group. Or if you want to expand it fully, then you can control middle mouse button click over this node. And if I hit F, that's going to set these nodes to focus. I can go back to my top level by selecting this little house, or go back up one level if you have many embedded groups. What you can also do is select this plus icon and then select this one over here if you want to fully expand it without the use of the shortcut. And so I'm going to call this materials. And what I can also introduce is the backdrop node. So if I hit tab and select backdrop, I can then use these backdrops to kind of describe what is happening at any given point. So I'm just going to call this geometry, and I'm going to increase the font by, I think, 3. It's quite large, 2. And then you can choose its color over here and select OK. And you can, I'm just going to create multiple backdrops to indicate what's happening at any given point. So it's always easier to orient yourself around your scene when everything is tagged in a nice and obvious way. Tab, backdrop, and I'm going to create one for the materials. If you select on a backdrop, it's going to also select the nodes it contains. If you want to move around a backdrop without its node, you can select Control and drag this across. So that's going to move it independently. And I'm just going to select this to a green color, call this materials. And what you can also do is color nodes. So if I select on this node and select on the colors over here, and now change it to a green color, then you can also color your nodes as you go along. Another way you can organize your scene is through the use of dots. So if I hit tab and type in dots, it's generally just a dot node. So if I delete this, what you can do is select a node. If you want it to, if you want there to be a dot within this connection, then you can hit dot. It's going to create a dot over here, and then you can start controlling the direction of your lines in the node graph. Don't hesitate to ask any questions at any point. If you're curious about anything, if you want a how-to for a specific thing that you're trying to do. And we've pretty much set up our scene. So what I can introduce now is the DL settings node. So if I hit tab and type in DL settings, so these are the kind of global settings specified in 3D Light. So if I hover over this and hit E, you can see that you have your samples parameters over here. So you can increase that or decrease that. I've actually got quite a lot of reflection fraction happening. So I'm just going to increase this all the way up to this value. And the overrides section in the parameters, over here you can also select You can also select overrides in your interactive previewing. So if, let's say, you have a large scene, it's taking a long time to render, then you can reduce the resolution to about half of the value and the sampling to a percentage you might want to set it to. So if I send off a new live render, these should be applied. There we go. You can see now the window is a lot smaller. And so these parameters are overlooked when you send off a batch render. So if, let's say, you're playing around with your scene and you have this optimization happening and you forget to revert it when you send off a batch render, it doesn't matter. These parameters are completely ignored when you send it off to render multiple frames at once, so you don't need to worry about that. We also have the interactive render filters. So if I untick this, if I hit tab and type in IRF, interactive render filters, then this is going to do a similar thing in optimizing your scene temporarily, just for when you're working within your scenes. So if I create a new render filter, and I'm just going to add a node. So I'm going to add a DL settings node. So over here. And let's say I want to increase the samples or decrease the samples by about a half. So I'm just going to set this to 32. And I'm going to call this half shading samples. And then once I select on this icon over here, then you'll see that this render filter will be applied, and you can then add them or remove them. And so if, let's say, I just select a preview render over here, and then I set my interactive render filters, activate them, then I sent another render, then my samples will be halved at that point. So it's going to give me a much grainier image. But if I'm just tweaking at this point, I don't really care about that. So I see that we have about roughly about 10 minutes left. Brian, are you okay in the question side of things? Given that, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's been pretty quiet on this end.
Okay.
Once you guys have any questions, just feel free to post them in the questions tab.
Yeah, definitely. And we've pretty much achieved our aim for this session. That was to get a simple scene set up. So hopefully now you'll feel a bit more confident about picking up Katana for one of your projects, if you want to do that. And hopefully it'll remove a lot of myths that you might have you might have regarding this tool. So before we go, I would like to just point you to some places where you can get some useful information. So if I switch back to this, then there is the Foundry Learn page where you can find some tutorial videos. If you want to learn more about Katana, then this is the place to go. A lot of useful information and tips are here. So if you like this session, then you'll like this too. We have some tutorials for Katana 3.1, just getting started. So it's very basic. It's very similar things to what I would have covered today. We have the core concepts, which was just been put up within this week, actually. And it's going to cover a multi-shot scene. So you can download the assets with it. And you'll be able to put together a Katana project with multiple shots within the same scene. So a file of 21 shots in this example, and switch across them quite easily. And we also have a new Look development tutorial series in an introduction to using the network material create nodes. The support team is also here to help with any questions or issues you might have. You can post on the Katana community forums to get help from other users or ourselves. And if you want to raise an issue with Foundry support, you can contact us directly or contact your lecturers, and they can contact us too. And I hope that you all know that students get a free education license for a year. So make sure you take advantage of that. Katana and 3 Lite are part of the bundle. So after a year, you can also renew it at a highly discounted rate. So all this information is on the education section on the Foundry website. So take a look at that part of the website if you're interested. And so if we have no more questions coming through, if I have the green light, then this pretty much wraps up the session. I hope this was helpful in helping you getting started with Katana, and hopefully now you can start building your projects. If you have any thoughts, suggestions, feedback, we'd love to hear from you at education@foundry.com. Thank you.